covered the whole shift from an analog manufacturing system to a digital manufacturing system. In the 1990s, there was no such thing as computer-aided design because we didn't have Unix workstations. We didn't have Unix workstations because we didn't have RISC processors, reduced instruction set computing. This is what I covered. I was editor of High Performance Computing and Communications Week. I covered the birth of the internet. The Reagan administration threw so much money at digital technologies, at computing, at fiber optics, at the DARPA net. It all just gelled in the 1990s. Unbelievable growth of technology. We took the computer from the basement, stuck at the supercomputing centers around the country, linked by the DARPA net, and we put it on the desktop. When it was put on the desktop, I got to know Jim Clark, who was the president and founder of Silicon Graphics. He says, "Who wants to look at data?" "I don't want to look at data." I said, "Why not? That's what we've always looked at." He says, "I want to look at the graphical representation of the data." I go, "What use is that?" We were looking at reams of data on computers because we didn't have the computing power capability to change that data into a graphical representation. He said, "It's going to be huge." The internet, I remember when the internet came out and I started poking around the internet. The first time it was like images on your computer screen. It was a big deal. There was no such thing as CAD. I covered AutoCAD, CATIA, Unigraphics. I went to this Teamwork and Technology show by General Motors up in New York. They had these guys who had these big wires, and they had cars made out of clay. This is 1988. This was CAD. All that got onto the desktop. Then we had, at the same time, we had the growth of the relational databases. And the relational databases allowed a company to take all the financials from everywhere around the world, and they could do this now because they had the computing capability to do it and the software. And they could take an apples-to-apples comparison of what their operations were doing throughout the world. So they could compare without having to try to adjust for currency devaluation differences and changes. They could compare on an apples-to-apples basis all their operations globally. So we had the growth. SAP and Oracle didn't really exist in the early 1990s, but because of relational databases, because we put all this computing capability on the desktop, because manufacturing started to get out of the analog system and became part of this whole Moore's Law, the doubling of capability 18 months. These are the stories I was covering. Then we had the rise of the internet. And the rise of the internet created B2B e-commerce, business-to-business e-commerce. We had supply chain management. We had product data interchange. We had all sorts of ERP and MRPs, and all these things were important. This is what I covered. And really, all that changed. All that changed in 2000. The other thing that I covered closely in the 1990s was the rise of the electronic contract manufacturers, the EMS. Selectron, they won the Bulletin Award twice. I got to know Winston Chen, who was the founder of that company. He had worked at IBM. IBM outsourced all their manufacturing to Selectron. Celestica, SCI Systems, Flextronics, Jabil, these are all names we probably know. They were big in the 1990s, the EMS companies, Electronic Manufacturing Services, the model for outsourcing your manufacturing. That's what I covered. I went to this, and all through the 90s, by the way, because of this technology, because of all that we were learning about best practices and about quality and the like, manufactured goods were going down. We didn't have inflation. We've had unbelievable growth in healthcare costs, unbelievable growth in education costs and energy costs, but our inflation rate's been low. And it's because people like you have deployed the technology in the most unbelievably productive manner. So all through the 90s, we had people like Ignacio Lopez at GM saying, you have to reduce your costs, you have to reduce the price of your product to us, the OEM, by 10%, 12%. And then in 2001, 2000, we had NASDAQ crash. And we lost in overnight demand for, because there was a bubble, this internet bubble, the dot-com bubble. We had all this capacity in the high-tech industry making switches, computer switches, or fiber optic switches, routers, and the like, Cisco systems types of products, and demand just tanked. And I started listening to the conference calls from these EMS companies and with their financial analysts. And because demand had fallen off a cliff. They started saying demand fell off a cliff. It fell by 60%, which is what the machine tool industry suffered this last year, 63% drop off in demand. The U.S. machine tool industry is a shadow of its former self. But because demand had dropped off a cliff, they had to reallocate their production capability. And they all started talking about their global footprints. And what they meant with this euphemism was, and I'd never heard it before, so it struck me as it kind of sounded like a Sasquatch thing, you know. But what it meant was they had to close their high-cost capacity, and because they had the capability of assessing on an apples-to-apples basis where their high-cost capacity was, they all said we're closing our American production capacity. And it went down like that. Overnight, it went down like that. I went to this meeting in Washington at the National Academies of Sciences in 2003, and it was sponsored by the NIST Manufacturing Engineering Lab, and they were talking about the future of manufacturing. And one of the speakers, David Cassidy, who is the Vice President of R&D at United Technologies, put a slide up. It's called the bevel gear example. It's a bevel gear example, and it had two pictures, a picture of two bevel gears, identical. And he says, and on the top it says, can you tell the difference? And, you know, I'm sitting there just like I normally do at a conference, knowing that something, usually you go to something, and it's most of it's boring because it's stuff you already know, but you usually get one thing out of it or two things and it's worth it. It's like reading a golf book. If you get one thing out of it, it's worth it. So I'm sitting there, you know, kind of dozing. And then the next slide comes up. And the next slide is the bevel gear example. Here's the difference. And it has the two bevel gears, and on one bevel gear, there's a price tag, and it's say, made in USA, $921. And the next bevel gear is made in Poland, $256. And below it, with an exclamation mark after, is cost savings of 75%. Boing! Now, United Technologies is a big company in Connecticut. And there are a lot of aerospace suppliers to United Technologies. And now, I'm sitting there going, this is profound, folks, because all through the 90s, Ignacio Lopez was telling you you had to reduce the price of your component or your part by 12%. Now you have to reduce it by 75%. The ramifications have been monumental. I was at a meeting a few weeks ago, and manufacturers were complaining about not getting credit because the bankers who would provide them credit said, the cost of your product are not competitive with those from China, so we're not going to give you credit. So now you have to compete with that. This is a new world. Ralph Gomer, who I really like, he's formerly president of the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation. He's concerned about all these issues about America's future and the like, and so he's gotten to know me. He's reached out. He was vice president of R&D at IBM for 15 years, and he's a brilliant mathematician, and also he's worked on economic theory. And he's told me something repeatedly that just sticks in my brain. I can't get it out of my brain. I think about it every day. And first of all, he says, and this isn't what sticks in my brain, but it's important, he says, the interests of the corporations no longer align with the interests of the country. Yet our government acts as if they do. So our government still is responding to the interests of these companies who've moved all their production offshore and are very profitable. Even in this downturn, those companies are very profitable.